All right, guys, I want to walk you through our first set of notes here. And this is like the very first lesson that you will have had in this class. And so I want to make sure you understand how the notes that are like the companion to this class work out. So I give you guided notes so that you can keep up with the stories, process through them pretty easily. And you'll notice that the slides that I'm going to walk you through should allow filling out those notes to be really straightforward, because the way I designed the notes is they're actually study guide questions. And so I give you questions that you are going to be answering as you move through, so that like the notes and the study guides are one and the same thing, so that you can process this material really quickly. So what we'll spend this first unit doing is just making sure that you have a pretty good idea of what mythology actually is, because so many people come into this course or talk about mythology and they really have a really limited view of what mythology is actually about. And typically it's just they assume it's about gods and goddesses, which could be true, but it's not exclusively true. In fact, there are some mythologies that have very little to do with gods and goddesses whatsoever. And I think giving you a baseline for what mythology is should help you understand why that is the case. So this first couple of notes, set of notes that we'll walk through, it's just like laying that foundation for you. So if you notice in your notes, if you have those, you have those beside you. The very first thing that it says or asks you is that mythology is not just what, okay? And the main thing I want to make sure you get, and the first thing I always say when teaching this class, is that mythology is not just, okay, myths are not just made up stories or lies. So if you're taking notes, that's what you would fill in there. And the reason for that, and to make sure you understand this, is that most people, when we hear the word myth in English, we immediately associate that with something that is false. Like the whole idea behind the show of Mythbusters was to see if these concepts were actually not true. Okay, that's what they were trying to do. And so if I call something a myth in that context, I'm telling you that I don't think it's real. But if I call a piece of literature myth, totally different idea, because for a myth to be a myth, part of a mythology, it has to actually have been believed to be true by somebody at some point. Now, the people who believed these would have been the original tellers of those stories. That doesn't necessarily mean that people still believe them today. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will believe them today, or that maybe anyone believes them today. But if someone did not at some point believe that what they were telling was fact, not fiction, it does not fall into the category of mythology. And we really have to wrap our minds around that. So it has to be believed to be true by somebody at some point. The problem we run into with this is that they come from oral cultures. Like dominantly, when we're looking at mythology, we're talking about oral culture transmitting these stories. Now, oral culture means that they didn't have written language, or they did not have a developed written language, and so they were passing down their stories primarily through word of mouth. Now, the problem with that is things change. Okay, if you've ever played like every elementary teacher's favorite game, like telephone, where you like whisper something in somebody's ear, which during COVID-19, obviously we're not going to be playing this game. But if you like whisper something in somebody's ear and then they whisper it into somebody else's ear, and it goes all the way around the circle until it gets all the way to the end, and then the last little kid stands up and they say what they think they heard, and it's like completely different from what the message actually started off with, and everybody laughs because there's nothing funnier in the world than those two messages not being the same. That's what oral culture is like, right? Because two things in that game cause the stories to cause the message to change, right? Number one is you just don't hear the message completely right. Like maybe the person in front of you has like a lot of saliva in their mouth and they kind of spit in your ear and it gets in the way. And so you don't really hear the message as it's coming through. And so you just give it your best shot and you tell them what you thought you heard. Or maybe they spoke fine, but you sort of weren't paying attention real clearly, or you kind of forgot in the time period between when they whispered in your ear and when you had to turn and deliver to the next person. And so you give your best bet of what they said, but it's not completely true. Some of the details get lost in transmission. That happens in stories. When these are passed down from generation to generation to generation, things are lost in translation. Okay. The other thing that happens is there's always at least one of these kids in every single class who really is bought into the idea of there being nothing funnier than it being completely different by the time it gets to the other side. And so what do? They change it on purpose, right? Maybe you were this kid. That could also happen in mythology. We have no way of knowing that. And so therefore, although we know these myths were believed to be true by somebody at some point, what we don't always understand is which version was believed to be true. What we do know, though, is that they're passed down because they're traditional tales. That's where we're going to pick up next time. Merry Christmas.